Hello, Michigan Realtors, and welcome back to a special installment of the Letter of the Law. Last week, you received a communication from Michigan Realtors related to real estate forms and the August 17th practice changes. Michigan Realtors is pleased to provide members with a variety of different real estate forms as a member benefit, forms that are user-friendly and easily understandable by Realtors and their clients. Now, the biggest change in the industry as a result of the NAR Settlement Agreement will be that commissions paid to buyers' brokers must be established via contract between the buyer and the buyer's broker. The argument has been made that if buyers have no obligation to pay any portion of the buyer's broker commission, buyers will have no incentive to negotiate a lower amount. Now, pursuant to the settlement agreement, it will be the buyer that will be obligated to pay the buyer's broker. However, if agreed to by the seller, there are a number of different ways that all or part of that obligation can be assumed by the listing broker or the seller. Today, we will discuss the changes that have been made to the Michigan Realtors forms to accommodate this new compensation structure. Exclusive buyer agency contracts. Now, under the settlement agreement, an agent working with a buyer cannot show the buyer a home before entering into a written contract with that buyer that includes the compensation amount that the buyer agrees to pay. Now, the Forms Committee recognized that some buyers may not be ready to enter into a traditional exclusive buyer agency contract this early in the game. The form has been amended to include a choice. The parties can agree that the scope of the agency relationship will cover any property that the buyer purchases, or, in the case of a buyer who is not yet ready to commit, the scope of the agency relationship may apply only to the particular properties that the buyer's agent has agreed to show. Of course, it is up to each firm to decide whether and under what circumstances they are willing to offer the more limited exclusive agency option. If a limited buyer wants to see homes other than the ones listed in the buyer agency contract, the buyer's agent will need to have their client sign a new contract covering the new showings. Or, hopefully at this point, the buyer may be willing to sign an exclusive buyer agency contract that covers all properties. The settlement agreement requires the buyer agency form to include language advising buyers that commissions are negotiable. This is intended to make clear to buyers that commissions are not standard in the industry and that buyers are free to shop around among firms. Now, this language does not prevent a particular firm from setting a non-negotiable compensation amount for its agents. Now, regardless of who is paying, a buyer's broker cannot receive more than the amount that the buyer has agreed to pay. The contract must provide for a definite amount and cannot, for example, include a clause that provides that the buyer's agent is entitled to whatever additional amount the listing broker or seller is offering to pay. As has traditionally been the case, the buyer's broker's agreement still includes a provision whereby the buyer gets a credit for any amounts paid to the buyer's broker by the listing broker or the seller. Again, if the listing broker or seller offers more than the compensation called for in the buyer's broker contract, the buyer's broker is not entitled to the additional amount. Exclusive listing contracts. Listing brokers can no longer offer cooperating compensation through the MLS. However, listing brokers can make offers of cooperating compensation outside of the MLS as long as authorized in writing by the seller. For this reason, Michigan Realtors listing contracts continue to include that option. As before, the Michigan Realtors listing contracts forms set out the amount the seller will pay the listing broker and then the portion of that total amount, if any, that the seller wants the listing broker to offer buyer's brokers. As required under the settlement agreement, the listing form states that the listing commission amount is negotiable and that any offer of compensation to cooperating brokers is wholly within the discretion of the seller. Historically, many buyers have asked for the seller to pay all or a portion of the buyer's settlement costs. Now, this is still permitted, and in fact, the settlement agreement specifically allows a seller to attempt to attract buyers by letting them know, through the MLS, that the seller will consider offers asking for seller concessions. Now, this possibility has been added to the Michigan Realtors listing forms. Keep in mind that while seller concessions can include all or a portion of the buyer's broker's compensation, an offer to consider concessions cannot be limited to the buyer's broker's compensation. Also, buyers cannot rely on an offer of seller concessions in the MLS. As will be discussed later, in order to be binding, an agreement to pay concessions must be explicitly spelled out in the purchase agreement. New addendums to the purchase agreement. Now, what if your buyer is interested in a home where there is no offer of compensation from the listing broker and no mention of seller concessions in the MLS? If your buyer needs help with their commission obligation, your buyer can request that the seller pay all or a portion of their compensation obligation in one of two ways. First, even if the seller has not invited offers asking for seller concessions, there is nothing that prevents a buyer from using the purchase agreement to ask for seller concessions. Michigan Realtors has created an addendum to a purchase agreement that does just that. Obviously, a seller is not required to agree to pay any concessions. On the other hand, a seller may be willing to do so, particularly in the case of an otherwise strong offer. Now, the second new addendum to a purchase agreement does not cover all settlement costs, but is limited to all or a portion of the compensation that the buyer has agreed to pay their buyer's broker. A buyer can use this addendum to ask the seller to contribute to this expense. Now, the new purchase agreement addendums do not affect the buyer's broker's compensation amount in any way. That amount has already been agreed to in the buyer's broker agreement and cannot be changed other than through an amendment to that agreement. Now, these addendums simply take the already agreed upon buyer's broker compensation amount and allocate responsibility for payment between the buyer and the seller. This is no different than a typical purchase agreement's allocation of other expenses such as title insurance or well and septic inspections. Finally, keep in mind that the only parties bound by the terms of any contract are the actual parties to that contract. The only two parties to the purchase agreement are the buyer and the seller. For this reason, the purchase agreement cannot be used to negotiate the payments of compensation from the listing broker to the cooperating broker. New compensation agreements between brokers. Now, historically, when a listing broker made an offer of X% to cooperating brokers through the MLS, the conditions for collecting that amount did not need to be spelled out. The conditions for collecting the amount offered through the MLS were governed by the arbitration manual. For example, in order to get paid, the cooperating broker had to be considered the procuring cause of the transaction, and the transaction also had to close. Now that offers of compensation will be made outside of the MLS, the same terms no longer automatically apply. Going forward, if a listing broker offers cooperating brokers X%, whether via its website or email or a text, the listing broker also needs to establish the rules for collecting that amount. Remember that under current Michigan law, agreements between brokers to share a commission need not be in writing. Two realtors who discuss a split orally or via text can walk away from that exchange with very different understandings as to what they agreed to. Now, in order to avoid arguments as to the agreed upon terms, it is important that the conditions for collecting a commission are reduced to writing. The new Michigan Realtors compensation agreement between brokers incorporates the same basic conditions previously provided as part of the MLS arbitration rules, so you'll want to familiarize yourself with the terms of paragraph 2. Listing agents should not wait until an offer is presented before they discuss the conditions for payment with the cooperating agent. Listing agents who tell a potential cooperating agent that the firm is offering X% need to make sure that, at the outset, the recipient knows about and has access to the conditions that must be satisfied in order to get paid. In conclusion, and before we wrap up this installment, I wanted to drive home a very specific point. While use of Michigan Realtors Forms Library is completely optional, it is important to note that these forms are not intended to be utilized without brokerage approval. The forthcoming changes are going to demand a significant commitment to education, training, and broker supervision to ensure compliance and understanding. And irrespective of the forms that your brokerage firm elects to use, please take great care in understanding how the forms operate. This continued commitment to professionalism and education will be a key moving forward. And as always, if you have any questions related to this special installment of the Letter of the Law, please send those to the email below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.